Brian Dowling reporting there. And Barry Cowan, let's start with you, seeing as how you're on the Fianna Fáil negotiating team. No Taoiseach last Thursday. The Dáil is going to meet again on the 22nd, but there's not going to be a vote for Taoiseach until the 6th. Is Fianna Fáil's primary objective here to make sure that Micheál Martin wins that vote for Taoiseach on the 6th?
Well, our primary objective is to try to remain true to the mandate that we sought and achieved. We would have as much progress as we made and as much seats as we won and more than doubled our representation in the Dáil. We did not achieve enough seats to have an absolute and overall majority. That's quite obvious. But we are...
No, that's what I'm trying to get at is, what's your strategy here? Is it to try and get Micheál Martin elected Taoiseach and then to try and put a government together?
Well, look, the mandate we received, mandated us to seek to provide an alternative government, to seek to provide an alternative leader of government, to seek to provide a new government. And that's the mandate that we want to enter these negotiations based on. We want to seek to provide that to the people who gave us their support. So we'll talk to like-minded, smaller parties and independents with a view to exploring a common ground where we have, where we can reach agreement, and seek to build bridges on other issues in order to formulate a policy and a mandate to achieve the sort of change that the people allowed us to seek.
There's lots of stuff about mandate there, but I'm not really very clear on your strategy there.
No, it's very clear. It's very clear on you. We went to the public and we said we want a mandate to change government, to change the direction of government, to change the policies within government. The people have given us that mandate.
What does that change mean?
No, that change means to prioritise public services.
Does it mean going in with Fine Gael, maybe?
No, it doesn't, because that was the one thing if people want to restore faith in politics, we can't break the one promise we made, or one of the main promises and one of the main platforms on which we sought that change. And that was not to go into government directly with Fine Gael, but to offer an alternative.
Okay.
And we have the opportunity to explore that alternative.
If what you're saying is true, and I do want to bring in the other panellists, I just want to clarify this with you. If what you're saying is true, you gave no mandate to go into government with Fine Gael, that means there is absolutely no question already of a grand coalition. You're ruling that out now.
We're ruling that out now because we believe we can offer an alternative government to that which is led by Fine Gael, and that is a minority administration led by Micheál Martin and led by Fianna Fáil. And that's the negotiations we are entering into this week with a view to trying to maximise our potential to deliver that mandate.
Pascal Donoghue, what's Fine Gael's strategy in this then?
Fine Gael's strategy is to get as many votes as we can behind our candidate for the Taoiseachship, which is
to win that vote on the 6th.
I think there are many stages ahead of us. In direct answer to your question, I think there will be more steps even after the 6th in relation to all of this. And I think we need to shift gear completely here now in terms of how this matter has been dealt with by political parties. There's an obsession now about the next election, about what that's going to bring. The focus has to be on how we provide the next home to somebody in emergency accommodation, the next bed to somebody who's in a trolley in a hospital.
Which is why people want a government, and which is why I'm trying to work out what strategies each of you have to achieve a government. So Fine Gael, you're the largest party, you have the advantage of incumbency. What do you do? Do you believe, for instance, we're not going to get a Taoiseach on the 6th of April?
And I'm answering your question. We're going to go into the 6th looking to get as many votes as possible behind Enda Kenny. He's currently a caretaker Taoiseach, but we want to have a new administration in place that's stable, that has good policies for our country and has the ability to deliver them. So the first step in all of that will be in the coming weeks to meet smaller parties and to meet independents, to look at areas of common ground being about how we can fix the things that we know need fixing in our country and put together an administration based on those policies.
Okay, I'll come back to the question of a minority government in a minute, but let's go into Sinn Féin's position in the Dáil here. You've a decision to make on the 6th, whether you vote down either man who's got the realistic chance of becoming Taoiseach, or else you abstain and allow a government to be formed. What's your personal preference, John Brady?
Well, I suppose the Sinn Féin perspective on all of this, we sought out and we achieved a mandate from the people, and we were quite clear from the outset that we wanted to lead a progressive government, and that under no circumstances would we prop up a government as a minor partner of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael.
So the question is, what kind of opposition then you're going to provide? Are you going to provide a constructive opposition that allows a government to be formed by, for instance, abstaining on crucial Taoiseach votes on the 6th?
Let's be quite clear. People went out and voted for change and gave the outgoing government, Fine Gael and Labour, a thrashing. They came back with reduced numbers. Sinn Féin, we laid out clearly our alternative government, what we wanted to do, what we wanted to put in place in terms of building a fairer, more equitable society for people.
But you didn't get a majority, and you have come back. You have come back to the Dáil, and the question is, you seem to be ruling yourselves out of playing any role in government unless you're the biggest party on the pitch.
Absolutely.
So what are you going to do in terms of opposition? Are you going to be constructive in allowing the two men on either side to you to put a government together?
Well, I suppose just on the point there, and the media seem to be focused on this, and it might be a new phenomenon for the media and certainly for other political parties, that when Sinn Féin make a commitment and achieve a mandate, nearly 300,000 people gave Sinn Féin a mandate, and our mandate was not to prop up a Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael government.
Because they're too right-wing?
Well, they're both centre-right political parties,
Okay.
and both have created the chaos in our housing, the chaos in our health service. As we sit here this morning, Anya, there's 493 people lying in hospital trolleys. We have 6,000 people lying in emergency accommodation. 1,600 of those are children.
Sorry, John, it's just, we all know, I think, the problems out there. What we're trying to do is work out whether we can get a government that's a solution. Now, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are too right-wing. How come your party is perfectly capable of sharing power with the DUP in Northern Ireland, which has to be one way to the right of either of those parties?
Well, I think you're not comparing like with like. That's a shared government up there. We're dealing with a different form of government down here. And again, we have said we will not prop up either of those, but we will if we find ourselves, and we will continue negotiating with the Right to Change parties, the individuals, the smaller political parties. But be under no illusions. If we find ourselves in opposition, we will be constructive. If Enda Kenny picks up the phone to us and says, he has a proposal there to build 100,000 social and affordable houses to deal with the housing crisis, we will support that. We will be constructive in opposition.
I want to bring in Teresa Reedy, who's listened to you all set out your stalls. Lots of talk about mandates, lots of talk about this is our position. Now, we all heard the clips from Sean O'Rourke the other day of the kind of statements we heard in 1989 about no, nay, never, but a deal was done with the PDs a few weeks later. Are we looking at the same again, do you think?
I think that is inevitable. We find ourselves in a very unusual situation now in Irish politics in that nobody appears to have any appetite for going into government. And if we remember back just some years, we heard about how the worst day in government was better than the best day in opposition. It all changed at this stage. It remains the case that between them, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael got just short of 50% of the votes, and they've over 60% of the seats. And I know people don't want too much focus on the arithmetic, but the reality is it's difficult to see any kind of government being able to pass legislation that doesn't involve some kind of cooperation between the two big political parties. But there is a spectrum of cooperation arrangements before them. It looks like the grand coalition is out, but certainly there are areas where cooperation could be achieved. Something like a super tala looks even more likely at this point. I suppose what needs to be discussed at this stage is what are the key areas where support could be agreed in advance. What are the likely flashpoints, and what influence Fianna Fáil would extract from Fine Gael for that level of support. I mean, there are some obvious areas that we hear a lot about. I mean, we can all talk about health and housing. They're quite obvious, but there are other areas where there are actually big decisions that remain to be taken in relation to areas of education, where there are decisions that are difficult, and those will have to also be teased out before an arrangement can be achieved. But a minority administration is one where everybody will have to work much harder than before, and it will deliver a kind of politics that's very different to what we have previously seen.
All right, but if we are to have this new, if a grand coalition is out and either of you are going to work in the direction, one of you might succeed in putting together a minority government, that is a new way of doing politics that certainly wasn't much in evidence on the first day back, which pretty soon descended into something that, if that's new politics, a lot of people might turn away from it. Barry Cowan?
Yeah, well, look, there is, despite the theatrics that took place on Thursday, there is a willingness on the part of most parties, it appears, to have reform, to have meaningful debate and legislation emanating from the floor of the House in the form of Dáil reform. And a committee has been put in place in order to explore that and report back to the Dáil. And I would hope that that has some success in that regard, because it's very important, as Teresa said, if the success that could emanate from a minority administration is one that can last and it can be meaningful. It will depend on real reforms being available to the House and to be available to all parties within it to play a meaningful role in deciding on legislation thereafter.
So the fiscal office, I forget the name of it, fiscal accountability.
Well, I think there's a useful analogy actually in one area of recent policy over many years, which is road safety. And this is something I've direct involvement in as current Minister for Transport, where there did exist a bipartisan consensus in relation to legislation like that. Now let's be very clear, and I experienced this myself. It did not mean that, for example, Deputy Timmy Dooley, who was the Fianna Fáil transport spokesperson, agreed with everything I was doing. It did not mean he voted with every piece of road traffic legislation. But what it did mean is there was a shared attitude to try and find ways of improving legislation as opposed to seeing it being the end product that more often than not led to it being passed by the entire Dáil. And I think that does offer a model of how we can look at in the future. And I agree with what Dr. Reedy said there. Areas like housing and health are obvious areas in which better engagement is needed. But if you look at, for example, challenges that we have in relation to school admissions, something I would feel strongly about as well. In order to move something like that forward, it won't just be a case of Dáil reform, though that may help.
Right.
It's going to be about a thirst to find a common ground, to better hear what somebody else is saying, and to try to put legislation in place that, if it doesn't reflect a consensus in the Dáil, might reflect a different majority in the Dáil beyond than what the government itself will command.
And in this kind of Dáil, John Brady, is Sinn Féin and the left simply going to sit on the sidelines going, any left you can do, I can do better, but not take responsibility for dirtying your hands with solutions?
No, absolutely not. And, this whole thing about Dáil reform, I knocked on many doors across Wicklow, as I'm sure Pascal and Barry did in their own constituencies, and not one person raised the issue of Dáil reform. Yes, it is needed and it's welcome, and Sinn Féin will play a constructive role in the cross-party forum that is established. But, if reform is anything to go on by the theatrics and the sham that the first sitting of the Dáil was on Thursday, where we seen a coming together of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to block a Sinn Féin motion that we were trying to table to deal with water charges, abolishing Irish water and water charges. And Barry mentions there that he saw it, they achieved the mandate.
You accused the others of theatrics. Just in the time that we've got,
Barry's
I want
right, he saw it and achieved a mandate. And I just ask, in his discussions on forming a government, he stated previously that Irish water and abolishing water charges were red line issues for Fianna Fáil.
You've made your position, and indeed you had a number of TDs who spoke at length about Irish water in the Dáil on Thursday. Theatrics?
Well, when I hear people talk about Dáil reform, I'm reminded of what Pat Rabbit once said about bond yields, that it doesn't butter any parsnips. And I think that's true about Dáil reform as well. However, what it is it's an enabler of change itself. If you have better procedures in place in the Dáil, it allows a new culture to have a better chance of doing well. And what I would say in response to the charge that's been levelled there, the first step in relation to Dáil reform or political reform is being a bit more respectful of the rules that are there at the moment, while then trying to change them.
Well,
and that's something I think Sinn Féin will well bear in mind.
And then Teresa, John, because you did make your point there. In fairness, I want to let the others in, because there was a lot of criticism outside the House, certainly, of Sinn Féin's role in any theatrics that I saw.
There was no theatrics on you. I think, if there is to be Dáil reform, maybe as a minister...
If you would answer John Brady on that point, please.
There was dishonest manoeuvring on the part of Sinn Féin on Thursday. They sought to play silly games and to hijack. There
was no silly games. We were given a mandate. We were given a mandate to go in and seek the abolition of water charges on Irish water. And
I think the biggest fear, John, I believe you and your party have, despite the fact that you made some progress in this election, you didn't make half as much progress as you had hoped. You fear now that if the likes of Fianna Fáil is successful, whether it's a red line or a thin blue line or a clothesline, you needn't worry about it, because we'll enter negotiations on the basis of what's contained in our manifesto with the intention of implementing all that's contained in our manifesto across a wide range of areas, including water charges, including water charges,
describing Sinn Féin trying to bring a motion to the floor of the Dáil abolishing water charges and describing it as theatrics, maybe you would have supported us.
I have to turn off your microphone if you keep interrupting people. Please, I told you I'm going to come back to you.
The greatest
Barry finished the point.
The greatest fear that exists for my colleagues here is that we may be successful in forming a government. We may be successful in bringing about policies and implementing those policies that affect the sort of change that the people wanted to see across a wide range of areas, including that of water charges. And I look forward to that potential. I look forward to those negotiations where we will deal with like-minded people who have also sought change and have sought an alternative government. We believe we can provide.
Coming back to the question about Dáil theatrics and the possibility of Dáil reform, I know you've done a lot of work, Teresa Reedy, with a lot of other academics, but it depends on the ability of the politicians to walk in there into the Dáil and act like mature grown-ups, given what we saw on Thursday, given the kind of debate we've heard for the past 10 minutes. Do you think that is something, you know, that is going to evolve in the 32nd Dáil, realistically?
Well, I think it might be required in the 32nd Dáil, depending on the outcome. If we see a minority government, I think there is just going to be no other option but to substantively change the way that the Dáil actually does its business, particularly bringing in backbench TDs and opposition TDs into the way that the business is done. I just wanted to pick up a point about this idea that the people aren't really interested in Dáil reform. I suppose, yes, on the face of it, people aren't interested in Dáil reform, but people are very dissatisfied with how politics works. And what they see on the television, the Dáil is a kind of manifestation of that. So maybe they're not interested in a big conversation about standing orders, but that's not to say that Dáil reform isn't a part of this bigger question about the way we do politics, how people perceive politics, and how they trust the political system. And the political system has taken a terrible hammering in the last couple of years. Trust in Parliament and political parties and politicians is all in decline, and Dáil reform is part of that conversation. People aren't really interested in how the HSE works day to day either. What they're really interested in is the output of that particular system. And I think we'd probably be able to say the same about the institutional reform of the political system.
And that's why that kind of change, and I do agree with that point, it's an enabler of bigger change.
Okay.
Like if you can get better procedures and processes in place, of themselves they might matter that much, but what they can yield is where the real value comes in.
We're going to be talking a little bit more about Dáil reform and what that might actually amount to after the break. But also one question, I can't let the panel go without asking you, Barry Cowan in particular. You were tipped by Bertie Ahern as the next leader of Fianna Fáil. If called upon to serve?
I don't know what role Bertie has within the organisation now, but his opinion doesn't carry much weight when it comes to voting procedures. But look, as flattering as that might be, it's of no relevance. You know, my sole aim and that of my colleagues in the party is to effect the sort of change that we were mandated to give, and we would hope to be successful in that regard.
And even Micheál Martin probably beating Enda Kenny at this stage in the most underestimated man in Irish politics states. But Paschal Donoghue, there's a lot of speculation about a future Fine Gael vacancy, and a lot of people have been mentioning your name as a dark horse.
Well, I'm still fresh with the relief of just having got elected to the 32nd Dáil, let alone and trying to figure out what's going to bring Anya. But in direct answer to your question, I won't be putting my name forward.
Okay. John Brady, I don't think you're a leadership candidate for anything.
No, I want to stay true to the people who voted me in and hold people to account. And maybe Paschal, while he's still drawing down a ministerial pension, or salary will come into the Dáil. A salary, €3,000 a week. So maybe he and his other ministers will come in and answer all the important issues relevant to people.
Thank you for making that point. I have to go to a break. Dr. Teresa Reedy is staying with us, and as I said, we'll be joined by some politicians from the smaller parties after the break. So I'd like to thank Paschal Donoghue, John Brady and Barry Cowan for joining us. We'll be back with you soon.